Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's show. I am Liz, joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. And I am so glad to be with you today. And I'm not quite sure just yet when this episode is going to air, but I just returned in the wee hours of the morning today back to Virginia from California, where I lived for many years, where I was celebrating the launch of my new book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine. Wow, wow, wow. Oh my gosh, what a feeling to have this book widely available in the world. I'm still riding all the waves of feelings and emotions here. This book is my love letter of sorts to the sacred feminine. And if you want to check it out, you can find it in the most obvious places where you would look for a book. However, I would encourage you to purchase it from a couple of different places, either from Womancraft Publishing, which is my publisher, which is a woman-owned business, incredible woman-owned business, or ask your local bookstore to order it for you. Or if you don't have a local bookstore near you or that's not convenient for you to get to one, you can order it from bookshop.org, which shares revenues with independent bookstores near you. And if you want to know more about it, you can check out womancraftpublishing.com. That's my publisher's site. I am planning at some point on my own website to get a cool splashy page dedicated to the book. I don't know, maybe that'll happen by the time this is out. But in the meantime, you can certainly find more information about it at Womancraft, and I'll put that in the show notes too. And with that, let's get on with the show. Okay, so I've been waiting to have this conversation for a while now, and I am so excited that the day is finally here. But first, a quick backstory. So one of the most fun aspects for me about writing a book, and also the most daunting, was thinking about, a book that's actually going to be out in the world, is thinking about cover art. What artwork on the front really conveys the message that's inside the pages? And especially with a subject like the sacred feminine, which can feel like, I guess to some, it could feel really in the ethers, so how do you bring that down into words and visuals? This just felt super important. So my publisher, Lucy, and I had so much fun kind of going back and forth and looking at different images and talking about ideas. And then someone shared in the Home to Her Facebook group, I don't even remember the post now, but they shared a quote, and it was paired with this beautiful, just most stunning image that I felt like I'd ever seen. And I spoiler alert, the artist is here with me, so we'll get into the specifics. But I just will say that it was so organic, it was so vibrant and so alive, and so representative to me of what the sacred feminine is. So I shared it with Lucy, and we kind of experimented with it on our own of like, what would it look like, if we put Home to Her on the cover? And I think we both felt right away like, yes, this could be it. But here's the thing, the artist has to agree to have their work licensed in this way. And the way that whole process unfolded, it just made me feel even better about the collaboration that ultimately, culminated in the final cover of this book. I have so much respect for this artist, her work, her ethics and integrity, and her activism in the world. And we're going to get into all of that today. So let's do it. Let me introduce her to you. Arla Patch is an artist, writer, teacher, and creativity midwife using art as a tool for healing. Her own challenging history provided the source material for using creativity for personal transformation. Making art has offered a powerful opportunity for her and those with whom she has facilitated art making: breast cancer survivors, incarcerated women, at-risk teens, and survivors of sexual abuse and domestic violence. Arla is the author of A Body Story and Finding Ground: Girls and Women in Recovery, each of which won IPPY Awards. She also wrote a heart story and a heart story coloring book. Healing continues to be a central interest in her life, as well as nurturing her spirituality. She's also an activist in the area of Indigenous Justice and a co-founding member of the Coalition of Natives and Allies. Her greatest joy is her grandson, Anders, and she is joining us today from her home in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. Arla, yay, we're finally doing this. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, Liz. And I do want to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Lenape people, known as Lenape Hoking.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And all right, you know where we start usually, right? I love to start. there's so much I want to just dive right into, but let's ground us in this place of your own spiritual background and how that started growing up and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. My spiritual life story is so based on context. And as you said in the introduction, there's a lot of source material there. My family of origin really was composed of both parents being unrecovered sexual abuse victims, which turned into them being perpetrators. So they
Wow.
sexually perpetrated my siblings and myself. And
Mm,
additionally, my mother was a suicidal alcoholic, and
mm,
my father, a Navy pilot. He must have been a dry drunk because he was incredibly domestically violent and did a lot of extreme corporal punishment on all of us.
wow.
So for me growing up, God the Father just did not resonate. I could not relate in any way. And around 11, I was very, very fortunate to have a mystical experience, which I have to understand actually, no doubt, has informed the rest of my life because it was incredibly powerful. And what
Mm,
that mystical experience was is I lived in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania with a large field next to it. And at the end of the field, there was a line of trees that were next to a creek. And they were my friends. And in this crazy, chaotic life, because by then my parents were divorced, but my mother's boyfriend molested me. And I was 10 or 11. And I remember running across that field frequently and going and climbing those trees and getting up to where the branches were really small so that my body weight swayed the branches. And
mm,
that was a huge source of sustenance for me, even though I didn't understand that on that level. So
mm,
one day I'm crossing across the field, and it must have been spring because the field was incredibly soft. It felt like it was freshly plowed, and time literally stopped. And this is the thing about a mystical experience, there's no logical explanation for it. But I stood there, and it felt as though my feet were deeply planted in the earth. And I felt the layers of the earth up to my hips. And then from there up, I felt this sensation of being up in the cosmos, up in the air. But in addition to this feeling, probably the most significant part of it was I absolutely felt seen. And having two narcissistic parents, the sensation of feeling seen was overwhelming. And
mm,
it wasn't just being seen, but it was actually being loved. There was this sense of feeling seen and loved. So that experience has never left me. And when I was 20 in Rome, as a student, I realized that I could actually make a sculpture. And when I got back home to Philadelphia in art school, I made a monument to that moment. So that lives in my house still. So every day
wow.
I see it. The thing about that, though, that was so significant in terms of my spiritual path is that I had a friend maybe in seventh grade. So I'm thinking maybe I was 12. And I stayed overnight at her house. And it was a Saturday. So I wound up going to Quaker meeting with her in the morning and never having been in a Quaker meeting house. When I walked in, I absolutely felt like I had come home. And then when I heard that the metaphor that Quakers use is the inner light, they say the inner light is that of God in you and everything else and everyone around you. And that metaphor made so much sense to me. As an artist, there was nothing about God the Father, there it was light. And it just absolutely made total sense to my being. And 60 years later, I'm still a Quaker. I'm a member of Doylestown Friends meeting. The thing about the Quakers, though, was it wasn't just my spiritual family. They also have been unbelievably supportive of my work as a
Mm,
community. I have gotten grants through Quaker organizations and groups that have supported the breastplate work I did with women who've survived mastectomies. I also, before I left Maine, I got grants to work with art and healing workshops with tribal communities. So it's essential to my work, to my being, to the way I see the world. And I've called myself a pagan Quaker because I I I experience the divine and divinity absolutely through nature. And that to me is one of the explanations for that book cover is that I am one with all of those things of nature. And my most powerful spiritual moments have been those with nature. Other than my son being born, that was the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And my art has largely come from my own healing from trauma. And it's those pieces of artwork that I did for myself that I then realized, maybe this could be helpful to someone else. And that's when I began sharing them with other communities of women, uh, incarcerated women, women who also had experienced sexual abuse and domestic violence, at-risk teen girls in a therapeutic boarding school out in Arizona. And the point to me was it worked for me, so it probably will work for them. And
Mm-hmm.
I was always stunned that it worked so well. So the one image that, for people who are seeing this video, I have the image from the first book, A Body Story, and it looks like a woman whose body is made out of lily leaves.
Mm.
And that was another mystical experience that happened to me. One morning when I was actually in a very difficult time of my life because it was a relationship that was breaking up and we were in different bedrooms. And I woke up one morning in my half sleep state and I actually saw a woman made out of ferns. And I thought, this is not just weird, this is a gift. There's something here. So as a photographer, I knew, and I had a single lens reflex and I put slide film in it. I knew that if I took a photograph, a slide of ferns, and then I were to project that on an absorbent black surface, which would be velvet, got in front of that and had help with focusing it on me, that maybe I would look like I was made out of ferns. And that is one of the 16 images in A Body Story. And it absolutely did look like I was made out of ferns.
Wow.
And the equation, and this is why I say I'm a pagan Quaker, because here was the equation that happened with that process. As someone who has suffered trauma and especially sexual abuse, there is a separation from your body. There is I could even go so far as to say, for me, there was a negative disconnect from my body, that my body was not sacred, that my body was not beautiful. And if I also did understand, however, that nature was sacred and nature was beautiful, and then I fused with nature, the equation is I then had to see that I was sacred and I was beautiful. And that actually worked incredibly powerfully with even the women in prison. They really did truly shift in how they saw themselves.
Wow.
The other process is second skin, which is mask making essentially, or also breastplates, or a mask that comes down and is on your shoulders, any combination of those. And my first experience with making a mask was so powerful that I realized there was something there as well, and went on to make many masks and breastplates myself, and then facilitated that with women who had had breast cancer. And a third process that has come about, ironically, it came from teaching elementary school kids,
Mm.
is using a slide projector to cast a shadow on a wall. And with kids, I just basically did their profile and traced it and then let them fill in metaphorically what was going on, like in their mind, kind of thing. But I found a really powerful use for this with both teenagers and adult women. And that was to first do a guided imagery with a group of, and I'll give this one example that was extraordinarily powerful. And this was a group of teenage girls who had all gotten in trouble in one way or another, and they were in this therapeutic boarding school. And first connect that circle, have everyone feel safe with each other and know that there's privacy, do a guided imagery, and then try to interpret whatever position their body made in that into a silhouette. So, for example, I had this one young girl, and she took me aside and privately asked if she could do a pose that was crunched up with her head curled down and her fists held tight. And she said that what had happened to her is that she'd been gang raped and that they had cut her. And could she cut her paper? And I said, absolutely, you can cut it, you can bleed it, you can do anything you need to do. So she went off and did that in her drawing and then brought it back to the group. the group witness is a huge, powerful part of that process. And then she pulled me aside after the witnessing and being able to tell that story to a group of girls and said, "Can I do another one?" And I said, "Absolutely." And this time her arms were thrown open, her head was thrown back, and she was in this dancing pose. And she said, "They didn't get me. I am a dancer." And this one
Mm.
was filled with purple and radiating, and it was just incredible. And to me, the power of, I call that bringing the shadow to light, is when you can access those aspects of trauma that are not really verbal, they really are visual. And if you think about humans on the planet, our visual acuity, our visual gift, sense, was really the most important initial one, long before
Mm.
language. We
Yes.
needed our visual. So it's a very deep place.
Yeah.
And that has been kind of the core of what I have discovered in working with art as a tool for healing. And then I came across this quote from Doris Banofsky Arrington, which just thrilled me because it gave validation to everything that I have been witnessing. And basically what she said was creativity or creative activity literally changes the traumatized topography of the brain. That creativity can literally change that traumatized topography and really help people transform. So that is the power of this thing I have stumbled upon in my life just because I happen to be an artist, a creative person who thinks visually and responds to things through that lens. That has enabled me to discover these three modalities that helped me. And then
Mhm.
I've been so fortunate to be able to share those with other people.
Yes. Wow. Okay. I have so many threads. We'll see which ones I can catch and we'll pull, to keep going with here. Okay. First of all, I wanted to know if you've ever considered coining a new term for yourself, which would be Quagan, Quaker pagan. You could start a thing because it's really,
Quagan,
it's
the
really fun.
Quagans.
It's really fun to say. And I bet
Yeah,
you're not the only one. Um,
yeah, absolutely.
my kids like to put words together. So as you were talking, I'm like, oh, Quaker pagan, a Quagan, how fun.
Yeah.
Um, well, I wanted to ask you, so a couple things, and when I hear you talking about this power of art, so it sounds like when I'm thinking of like how you found and connected to this idea of the sacred feminine and whether or not you would use that word, I felt like I heard you saying, and you tell me if I got this right, like it's sort of finding that sacred within yourself in your own body and you identifying as a woman, so it's there.
Mm.
I'm curious too about the art and the connection specifically to the sacred feminine. And then I just want to put a pin in this so we can go back to it. I'd love to hear you because my understanding of Quakers is that even way back in the day, they've always been much more welcoming and open to having women speak and be seen on equal footing as men, even, in the early days. So,
Yes, that's
yeah.
absolutely true. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the women of the women's movement in that monument up there in New York,
Mm-hmm.
uh, out of that group, I think 4 out of the 5 or 3 out of the 5 were Quakers because George Fox himself was such a feminist. He's the one who started it. And he actually had meeting for business in 2 separate rooms so women could have their own meeting for business and wind up developing those leadership skills, and very much valued the voices of everyone, because part of that, there is that of God in everyone. It means everyone, and it
Yeah.
means everyone equally. So yes, women have been empowered very much from the start in that path, which is
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I like about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Quakers were very involved in the abolitionist movement too, were they not? Which
Absolutely,
also makes so much
absolutely.
sense. Yes, and
Yep.
I know that
And
there were women. They haven't been passed down in history the same way the male abolitionists have, but there were some very powerful and prominent women who were involved with that, who were probably Quakers too, I would imagine.
yeah, and the Underground Railroad was Quaker families that
Mm,
were part of that whole process.
okay.
It's the thing about when you sit in silence and you ask for guidance and you try to hear that still small voice within you. One of the things that Quakers say is that all the birds could be flying in the wrong direction. And that's one of the reasons why within our meetings, we don't just vote. We actually have consensus. And sometimes it can take a while. But the point is that those people who do object, like the early Quakers who objected to slavery, um, those voices may be the truer path.
Yeah.
So it's really important to give them time and openness to listen to where those might take you.
Mm-hmm.
And far as the feminine, in terms of the cover of the book, I absolutely do see the sacredness and the beauty. And as you say, because I live in a female body and I've had to make peace with that body and what's happened to it, that is the way it usually manifests, in terms of, and also because to me, embodiment is so essential to recovery, especially from the kinds of things that have happened to me where your body's violated, that re-inhabiting of your body as a sacred vessel. So the cover of the book is Please Abide With Me is the title of that. And I have to give credit to the Huichol Indians for the yarn paintings, because one time when I was at the Omega Institute, I was teaching there and I was in the library, and that book of the Huichol Indian yarn paintings literally jumped off the shelf, if that's ever happened to you, and
Mm-hmm.
landed in my hands. And I looked at those yarn paintings that are done by a special person within the community who's considered a sacred seer, and through the yarn paintings, they validate the major passages and important events and sacred moments of their community. And it was little pieces of yarn pushed down in wax. And that just inspired me to use polymer clay and roll them as coils. So that image, which you can tell from looking at the photograph, I believe, is made of coils of clay. And the
Yes. Oh, I was going to say, yeah, please keep going, but I want to make sure you describe it for the listeners too, as best you can, of like what's happening on the cover. I'll definitely include a picture in the show notes, and I'll hold it up here for our viewers. But yeah.
So what I discovered was that if I roll these coils of clay, I do a drawing and then I make the drawing come to life with coils of clay, that and roll it all together, that it's a great way to kind of build a painting. I mean, my degrees in art are both in sculpture, and I also love to paint. So this is sort of a great fusion of both painting and sculpture, because I'm kind of doing a painting that I'm building out of
Mm-hmm.
coils. And I actually
Mm-hmm.
call it coil drawing. But I also really love the fact that it's something that I never had seen anywhere else, other than, as I say, in the yarn paintings. But I haven't seen anyone do it in this particular way. And artist as inventor has always been a thrill to me. That's one of the joys that we have, is that we can take something from nothing and create something that maybe no one's ever seen before. And I hope
Yes.
that that could be part of the dynamism that you mentioned, is that you saw this and you had never seen anything like it before. There's salamanders in my armpits, and there's a butterfly in my pelvis, and
And
there's,
it's yours. It's your body, right? Like
yeah,
it's yeah.
yeah. And I
Well,
love hummingbirds, so those are on the ends of, on the, I guess they'd be my nipples on my
mm-hmm.
breast, if I can say that.
Yeah.
There's a turtle shell for my heart. I love bees, and bees are in there. Shells. There's a snake for transformation, um, in the womb.
Yes.
And it just feels like a fusion with human and nature.
It's so powerful. Yes, and then even the the so to so it's an outline of a female body, and you don't see the whole body here, but as Arla is saying, there's all of these beautiful elements of nature woven in, and there's something even about, and there, it's on a bit of a white background, and I'm curious what this represented to you. You know, the body itself is this gorgeous green with all these vibrant colors from nature, and then there's a bit of a white background surrounding it.
Well,
What did
that's
the
kind of a given for, like all. Where I work as a color consultant, and I'm always trying to explain to people that if they want their artwork to show up, they need to sort of follow what museums and galleries do. Is they basically have a nondescript white wall, so that all the attention goes to the intensity and the color of the artwork. And that's basically what I did there. And I just made a kind of pattern of the way trees grow and branches grow in a kind of overlapping pattern, but the background is essentially white.
Yes, and I see the tree branches, and there's also something vaguely bone-like to me as well. Like I
Mm,
feel like an invocation of the bones too.
yeah.
It's just such a powerful piece, and there were things, Arla, that I think you didn't make it into my book that you wouldn't even know that were seeing the prominence of the hummingbirds, for example, which has just always felt like a very sacred guide to me and was one of the first beings that really showed up to me very powerfully when I started working with the sacred feminine.
Mm,
Snakes are very powerful to me. I do write about the butterfly and the symbolism of the butterfly in the book, but when I saw all of these elements, it was just like, this is this is so amazing, and it's alive. It's a very alive. And before I found this, Lucy and I were experimenting with, well, and I had found texture was somehow so important to me in the cover of the book because I felt like the content of the book itself, it needed to have more of a multi-dimensional feel. And so I was finding myself drawn to images that appeared to have some texture to them. And then,
mhm.
of course, when I saw this, it was like, well, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, it's nice to hear that. I didn't actually know that those elements were even more specific and special to you.
Oh, there's so many. I mean, yes, like even the dragonflies, these are all guides that I've been calling in my life. And the hummingbird is our family. Um, I'm not going to use the word, it is our family. And mascot is just way too minimizing, but I think you know what I mean. It is our
Yeah.
family guide.
Yeah.
Um, it's
Yeah.
over our altar. It was the one image that we took when my family moved into the RV and lived in it for 8 months, and that we would hang
Oh,
it up every place we got and take it down when
wow.
we drove. That this was
Yeah.
our such a powerful symbol to me. So yes, when I saw all this, I'm like, what? This is amazing.
There's one thing I did want to say too about the title, Please Abide with Me. It
Yes.
really speaks to the up and down that you have as you're going through life, where there are times when you feel the connection, and then there's times when you need the connection, and then you ask for the connection. And this piece to me was because the connection is actually always there. And it's
Hmm.
just that I forget that it's there. And so I had this almost as a reminder to me that all I need to do is breathe and it's there. So,
Yes, and you have this beautiful description, and you can buy this artwork, by the way, guys. I'll make sure I'll put this in the show notes. But you can have a print of this amazing piece for yourself. That does not have the name of my book on it. Like it can be for you, but you've got a beautiful description of. I don't have the words in front of me, so I'll put them in the show notes of what you just said, though, of like what that "please abide with me" means. That
mhm,
also spoke to me really deeply when I looked at it.
mhm,
And I feel like since we're talking about this piece, I kind of wanted to share a little bit about how this collaboration came to be because it I feel like it will also tee us up for your Indigenous activism work too. Um, but so when Lucy and I kind of agreed, we're like, okay, we love this. The next step is you've got to ask the artist. And as I said, the artist isn't always going to say yes, right? I don't know. Maybe some artists do. I've never written a book before, so I don't know how that works. But Arla, do you mind sharing, when Lucy reached out to you directly, like what your initial response was?
yeah, well, I'm basically your garden variety white girl who never really knew much about what happened in our country.
Mm.
And when I was about 14, I think, in Quaker meeting, we had something called First Day School, which is basically like Sunday school. And it was a great history class. And the man who was teaching it was the clerk of our meeting. And he mentioned something about Native Americans that was not what I was learning in school. And it just tore me up. I remembered my heart just aching. And I made a pledge to myself at that point that someday I was going to do something about this. I was going to try to look into this or be involved with this or do something. I didn't know what. Well, it took 60 years because it wasn't until I was in Maine and I had a friend who had left Maine and gone out to the Navajo reservation to be a counselor and had spent 5 or 6 years out there and then came back. And then she was going to return for a wedding. And she asked me, knew that I had this interest and asked me if I wanted to go along. And all I had to do was be in that land, on that landscape, to feel 500 years of what had happened. And then I came back and educated myself more. I did a search on the internet about Native Americans and Quakers and Maine, and the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up. So I put myself out there multiple times. It took many months. And I made the mistake of sending my books, which was really not a good idea because that looked like I was trying to use the tribes in some way or
Mm,
get something out of it. I mean, which is what's happened to them forever.
yeah.
And it wasn't until there was a phone call with people from American Friends Service Committee and the tribal communities in Maine that I found out that there was something that non-Native people could do. And I went up and volunteered. So I got a lot of teaching. Um, and what I realized was how unbelievably ignorant we are, and that we are actually on the land of people who have suffered a genocide.
Yes.
And when you look at the UN definition of genocide, we hit every single article, every single one. And the Truth Commission was just on one piece of it, which is what we did to Native children by putting them in the child welfare system. And that was only a follow-up from what we did of taking them away from their families as young as 4 and putting them in these boarding schools in the United States and in residential schools in Canada. So that was an incredibly important thing for me. And anything that feels a little new agey, a little, I just want to make sure that there's that awareness and that consciousness, and that I wouldn't put my art on the cover of a book that would make me feel regret and embarrassment to the Indigenous friends that I have in Maine and now here in Pennsylvania. And luckily, I'm so glad that it was very much respectful and very much aware of that white girl ignorance is the only thing I can call it, and
Yeah.
a need for real respect and real deference, and not making the assumptions that our privilege often has us just inadvertently stumble into.
Yeah. And I think that it is unusual, honestly, for an artist to say, thank you for reaching out, but I want to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to, that feels appropriative or would, um, st- I was going to say step on the toes, which is not, it's not the right phrasing, but, just honoring that you've got these deep relationships and that you're doing this work and that it is in alignment or not in conflict with that. And so Arla, that was Arla's response to Lucy, which Lucy shared with me. And my first reaction was, it was like this simultaneous, like dropping in the pit of my stomach. And also, yes, this is so perfect, because this was also one of my greatest fears in writing this, is that I felt so strongly that when we talk about the sacred feminine, it can very much be a white woman thing. And one of the reasons I shared this at my book launch, one of the reasons that I think that white women in particular have really gravitated towards the sacred feminine is because we too have experienced a loss of connection to the sacred ourselves. And that I think this is for especially women of European descent. We are grasping at trying to find what it means to have Indigenous roots ourselves that have been really, really oppressed, However, if we're not doing that if we're just doing that and we're not conscious of our privilege and all the ways in which, we have benefited and perhaps been silently complicit with what's happened, then we can create a lot of harm. And I didn't understand that even with the first draft of this book. I'm so glad that the first version of this did not get out there. So going back and rewriting it, that felt so important to me to name. And also, I was still aware of my own ignorance and saying, okay, I know that the sacred feminine is present in many traditions. And I want to make sure that if I'm talking about anything that's Indigenous to America, that I'm looking for Indigenous American sources here. I'm not making it up, and I'm not saying it's mine. But also, I'm a white girl and I hope I've got this right. And so, there is no getting it right. Let's just go ahead and say that. We got to let go of that need, because that's a whole patriarchal bunch of BS in and of itself. I think the intent is important, though. And so I was so grateful that you challenged me in that way, and she asked to read it first, which I think is also unusual for an artist. And so I was on pins and needles for a while,
Mm.
waiting to
Well,
hear what you'd say.
I'm also an author and have written books myself. So, sort of have a foot in both worlds, and most importantly, something that's this tender and important a subject, especially for all of us who have been living under the strain of patriarchy,
Mm-hmm.
because matriarchal communities like Native American communities are so different, and yet that is part of what we nearly destroyed.
Yes.
So, and the other thing I think that's really significant, Liz, I think is worth mentioning, because for all you white women out there who are listening to this, one of the issues that we do have is the loss of our tribal and ancestral territory. And especially if you're super mixed. I mean, part of the reason
Yes.
why I married a full-blooded Swede was because I was so attracted to this idea of being something,
Yes.
because I am such a mix of so many cultures that I don't feel that identity and that connection. And I think that's a lot of reason why a lot of white people keep stealing Native identity for tribes for sports.
Hmm.
Sports mascots is this longing to be part of our ancestral community, of our tribe. And it's so attractive the way it seems to us. And of course, we take it and completely bastardize it and turn it into tomahawk chops and, ridiculous rituals that have nothing to do with what Native people actually do. But it's such a violation because it is so blind also that they want an identity. They want that sense of community. And the other thing that, in terms of environmentally, is we don't live on land that Native people have been for thousands and thousands upon thousands of years. So there's an intense connection to the land. And that has a lot to do with why we violate it so much. In terms of the environmental movement, we really need to turn to Indigenous brothers and sisters to see how to move forward and how to think about it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I also wanted to name, because I did mention this at the book launch as well, and it's in the book, when I write about this, but that is specific with the sacred feminine. There is a storyline that is very commonly shared, that is rooted in history, that is somewhat based in truth, which is the idea that the sacred feminine died many thousands of years ago. She was killed by patriarchy, and we have to resurrect her. And I think we have to be very careful to recognize that that is truth for some people in some places. However, if you were to take that storyline to lots of people, including Indigenous Americans, I would imagine that many, I know, because I did some of the research, I don't, that many tribal traditions understood the sacred as feminine and the feminine as sacred, and did that until colonization 400 or 500 years ago. And those that have survived still do have it. So when we talk about this need to resurrect the sacred feminine, that is truth for some people, but you just cannot have that conversation, and it is ill informed if it's not woven with the narrative about colonialism and white supremacy and the rest. It's not enough. And
Mm-hmm.
that felt very, very important to name.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets a lot messier. I mean, there's just no getting around it. It gets a lot messier when we weave in all those stories, and it gets more. Now you're going to get closer to healing. It gets more authentic too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things that dawned on me just the other day that I thought was a surprise is, I was thinking about what you might ask me. And I was thinking about, if someone were to ask me, well, why did you get involved in the Truth and Reconciliation
That
Commission?
that that was a question I have. So yes, please.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that our motto for that Truth Commission was truth, healing, and change. And then I realized that's absolutely what I have been working on my whole conscious when I was in my 30s before I finally realized what this legacy of childhood abuse was. But the truth, it was about getting to the truth, which I never did get to with my parents because neither one of them ever acknowledged what had happened and what they had done.
Yeah.
And then it's the getting the truth out there, which I did on my own in many ways. And the art was part of that constellation of healing. There was also tons of talk therapy and all kinds of other modalities that I discovered up in Maine. And then the healing that comes from that. And when the healing comes from it, then there's the opportunity for the change, which is the transformation. So the core of the Truth Commission, truth, healing, and change, is really exactly the process of what needs to happen in order for trauma to be brought to the surface, to be seen, to be understood, to be acknowledged. And then that's where a possibility for transformation can happen. And
Mm.
so it made total sense. And then also that seed that was planted when I was 14. And the other thing is I have a lot of personal family history. That my cousin's a really great historian in the family, and he told me that our Dutch side actually owned a farm on Manhattan where the Twin Towers stood. Now that's Lenape territory. And how
Wow.
did they get a farm? you know.
Mm.
The other one is my great great grandfather was the chief engineer of the Pacific Railroad. So that picture of the driving of the Golden Spike, he's one of those guys down there for the Pacific side. That was just a horrific act of putting nails in the coffin once again, and in a very powerful way, because it enabled this rush of people to get out there and take over the lands, and the lands that were taken over to put the railroad. So I feel a lot of personal debt. But the truth is, it doesn't matter whether your family came over that long ago or whether they've only been here for 100 days. Anyone who's on this continent benefits from the fact that Native people were targeted and are still targeted for destruction.
Yes. Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned that sort of personal connection, because that's something I've been sitting with this word atonement for a while now. And I know that in certain Christian religious contexts, there's so many words that are like really loaded. Like, there's like lots of guilt that can hang off of you with atonement. But like doing research on my own family history and how privileged I am that I can do that in the first place. That in and of itself is a privilege, right? That we've got records.
Yeah.
I know for certain that my members of my family enslaved people. I know for certain that in honor of this service that that an ancestor did in the Revolutionary War, he was granted a land grant of indigenous lands. I know this. I know that one of my ancestors on my father's side died in a skirmish with Cherokees. I have all of this information, so I cannot say this isn't mine. Like, this is not, it is mine. It's flowing in me. And so I'm curious, for you, if there's been a process of, because we can really get bogged down with guilt, right? And then like, oh God, and that's not productive, but if there's been a process for you in sort of turning towards and owning that history and allowing it to open you towards action and figuring out what's yours to do.
That's exactly the process. I mean, when I was learning this, I was learning it over a period of a couple of years. And I realized that when I give this talk now, people have like 40 minutes and they're having to hear all of these things bombarded with the Spencer Phipps proclamation, paying for a bloody scalp of a
Mm.
Native person, which is called a redskin. And that being a price for a man, there's a price for a woman, less than, and then there's a price for children under the age of 12. That could be my 4-year-old, 5-year-old grandson.
Yeah.
I burst into tears when I heard that the first time. When I found out that Native people couldn't vote until 1954, I was 4 years old. I mean,
Mm.
and that Native people served in disproportionate numbers in the military, helping us win World War I, World War II with the code talkers, and they couldn't even vote. They were giving their lives for a country where they could not even vote. I mean, learning all of this would break my heart. I mean, I did cry a lot. The
Yeah.
thing I learned was that was my crime to do, and that not to ever, ever make it something that Native people had to deal with at all, if I could possibly help it. And actually, my very first night when I was going to meet with the Truth Commission folks up on Indian Island, up in the Penobscot, um, I went up the night before because it was a 3.5 hour drive, and the meeting was at 9 in the morning. And I stayed in a motel, and I could see the lights over on the island. And I thought about sitting down with Native people for the first time in my life. And I burst into tears. And I thought, all I want to say is, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. And I realized that that was absolutely not what I should do at all. So I just had this really good cry that went on for a really long time. And then I realized this is energy that I can actually use, because I can take all of this pain and sadness and guilt. There's no doubt there's guilt there, and use it as fuel and have it fuel action. The key, though, is that that action needs to be under Native leadership,
Yes.
because too many white people run down the road thinking that they're going to be big helpers and they're going to figure out how to do it and they know what to do. And my experience of working with Native people is that there's a whole other way of looking at many problems that are way better than the ideas
Mm-hmm.
that I might have had. And also, it's not my job. It's not my position. I need to sit back, shut up, and listen. And a lot of the very enthusiastic young people that I was the community engagement coordinator. So I ran into a lot of people at university, young folks, oh, I want to do this. I want to get my drum. And I can't tell you how many times my message was, please sit down, shut up, and listen. I had to be that strong in order to get them to sort of break out of their white privilege. I'm gonna do this my own way, or I'm gonna be a helper because I have an idea. And no, we needed to listen.
Yeah, it makes me think of something I learned way back in college that I think, you know what, I'm going to look it up and correct myself in the show notes if I get it wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was W.E.B. Du Bois. I took a class on Harlem Renaissance poetry and writing, which I loved, and I think it was W.E.B. Du Bois that was talking about your consciousness of social issues being very informed by where you are on the hierarchy of culture, right? Which is all patriarchy loves hierarchy. And so as a white woman, I can absolutely now see my oppression. Like I can see it. And I can see the privilege that white men have because they are ahead of me on the ladder and they're shaping all of this culture. But I have a much harder time seeing and experiencing and understanding what's happening for people who have less privilege than me. And as a white woman, I've always benefited from the privilege of white men wanting to, like protect white women.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think again, like the challenge is to like hold that, like it's all true, right? That oppression of women, very real. It is very real. And there are other people who are having completely different experiences and know that oppression in a different way, can see ours in a different way, certainly understand theirs in a different way. And so, you know, there's a thing I think that happens in talking about the sacred feminine too, where it's like you have suppressed yourself, you've quieted your voice, you must speak up, and it's true, and it has to be layered with, and you don't have to talk all the time. It doesn't have to be you.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
well, such a learning process. Wow. Do you feel, Arla? I know I've encountered this sometimes. Um, and I think I wonder sometimes if this is also um, an less than good gift of patriarchy. But there's this idea when you start to become aware of situations of the oppression of others that we're going to fix it. Like we are going to
Oh,
fix it,
oh,
right?
absolutely. I mean,
And
that's a standard thing that can be driven by guilt. Is if
yes,
I fix it, then I can get rid of my guilt. And
yeah,
how we understand fixing, and that's not respectful. I mean, that is not part of that sit down, shut up, and listen.
yeah. So has there been a process for you of releasing like not just my need to fix it, but even that I will see this fixed in my lifetime?
Yeah, I've actually been very aware of the fact that all of this effort, and so much of it is 99% of it's volunteer at this point. And so I have people around me who have said, why are you doing this, and why are you devoting so much time? And I'm a co-founding member of the Coalition of Natives and Allies, and we are 3 Native women and 2 ally women. And part of being an ally is that it is not a noun, it is a verb, and it is to serve and use the privilege any way that you can in service of the healing for Indigenous issues with Indigenous leadership. And that has been absolutely crucial and something that I have to constantly remind myself. And part of it is I'm a Pennsylvania certified teacher. I have been teaching for like 45 years and I'm an extrovert. So when you've taught middle school, you've done boot camp, especially art, where they've got supplies and, they have to move around and it's a little bit more organic. If you've had to deal with controlling that and making that work, you can be, I have to take my teacher self off when I deal with my son and my family. It's an impulse. So I've had to consciously, and this started up in Maine with the Truth Commission, sit there and just not say anything and wait and wait and wait and wait and then wait. And it wasn't until the end of my time working there when I finally decided to open up and offer art and healing, because I did not want in any way for it to seem as though I was somehow benefiting and it was going to be part of my career and part of my, brand. And they had been the group that I was with, which is, I think there were only 2 or 3 allies. The rest were all Native social workers and working for the Truth Commission. And I remember finally, we were on these phone calls because Maine is so huge that we were on these group phone calls all the time. I think there were about 16 of us. And they had been really seeking alternatives of healing from the trauma of what was coming forward, because they were going to communities and hearing the stories of what happened to members of those communities with the child welfare program, with adoptions and foster care and all of that. And they were saying, there's tapping, there's voice, there's all these cool things. And here I was sitting there with these art opportunities. So I just very gingerly asked if they would be interested in me getting a grant to do art and healing. And they said, yes, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And for me to implement that, I ran into my white scheduled, it's got to happen thing, working with the communities, and was very humbled by needing to just let it be organically happening based on, and I knew I was leaving Maine in the summer. And so I was very uptight about getting this all done, and that was a very, very intense teaching experience for me. And also just an incredible honor to be on Indian Island, the only non-Native person in a circle sharing a process of mask making. And I also did Bringing the Shadow to Light. And I promised absolutely that I would never, ever use the images. I would never share the images. I would never make anything out of that other than talking about it, but not even mentioning any details about any one person or anything that happened. So that was just a really important giving that for me personally, was very healing.
Well, and I wonder if you could speak to what your priorities are right now with the Coalition of Natives and Allies, and then how can we, how can I, how can listeners help that, and what you might suggest for us because for me, a lot of connecting with the sacred feminine, it was a big instigator for me in looking at some of my own personal trauma and healing, but that very quickly became clear to me that's a start. Like there's an activism component to me for sure, of like, we have, there's all this latent energy in women, I think, with female bodied people that needs to come out. And so I wonder if you could speak to how do we do that? And probably most of my listeners are white women. So how do we do that in a way that is not aggrandizing or stepping on others?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it is all about education. It's education, education, education. Most people who were supportive of Redskins probably didn't understand that actually refers to the bloody scalp of a Native person. And in fact, in order for them to know that it was a male scalp, they included genitals.
Wow.
If you understand that, then you might think differently. And we did do a talk actually at a church, And there was an African-American man in the audience who was a huge Washington Redskins fan. Of course, this was before they actually gave it up. And he went to the pastor afterwards with tears in his eyes and said, I just didn't know. I just didn't know. I'm going to give all my, I'm going to get rid of all my stuff about that. And I understand now. So to me, and this is one of the great tasks of our coalition, is education. We do presentations. In fact, I'm delighted that we just did the entire ninth grade of a school district in New Jersey.
Oh.
And we talk to churches, we talk to, community organizations, schools, anyone that we can, that we can get to understand how important it is to hear these truths, because we have a really interesting and unique program because it's both Native and non-Native voices. And I think that's really important because the white voices need to own the kinds of things that need to be heard by other white people that we need to own. And the Indigenous voices telling the truths about what have happened. And the stories within our program involve each one of the Indigenous women, one whose grandfather was taken to the residential schools in Canada. And she has photographs of him when he was only 6 in that school, and then when he was in his early 90s before he died. So to see a woman who had her grandfather there helps people to understand this is not that long ago.
Yes.
There's another woman who has been fighting for 10 years to get rid of the Redskins mascot in her school district in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And that school district has paid nearly $500,000 of taxpayer money to keep that mascot.
Wow.
And the third woman is an amazing story where she was, she's Dakota, and she was adopted at 3 months old, grew up in Pennsylvania, never having met another Indigenous person. And I think in her early 50s, she did a search and she found her Dakota family. She found her mother, her birth mother, and she found her brothers and sisters, of which she was 8 out of 9. And she got a good, I think it's 6 or 8 years with her mother before her mother crossed over this last January. And she tells her story of never quite feeling like she belonged, and then finding out who she really is, and it meaning everything to her. So having those stories within our program. So our program is really important because it really personalizes a lot of this, and it also educates people to just find out about, I only mentioned a couple of things earlier, but there's a huge arc of history that we just don't know. And then the other thing is we are working with a Pennsylvania state representative to really work on legislation to end using Native people as mascots and to implement real education in the public schools in Pennsylvania. And we would be following Maine, who was the first one to create state legislation to outlaw mascots, Native American mascots. And then there's several other states now. I think there's about 3 or 4, maybe 5. And there's movement in other states that are coming. Oh, Vermont just passed that law. So we want to be part of that across this country. And as you referred to earlier, it's possible that at 72, I'm not going to see what I vision and hope for. But as a man said in a workshop that I attended once at the Omega Institute, that was a Julia Cameron Artist Way workshop. And he used this great metaphor, which really helps. And he talked about the rocket launch. And he said, in the apex of that angle that they have of where the rocket is going to go, if they only change the apex a tiny degree or so out in space, it makes a huge difference. So I hold on to that as valuable, that these few little changes, like those little ninth graders that listened to us last week, those people sitting there might be like I was at 14 when I heard that. And I decided that someday in my life, I was going to do something to support healing in that area. And it's the transformation of consciousness that I really hope, and as part of the idea that the divine isn't just masculine. I mean, that's part of it to me. It's a transformation in consciousness, because when women are valued more powerfully, we can make change and healing. I mean, the Dalai Lama himself said, the world's going to be saved by the women of the Western Hemisphere.
I remember hearing that. Yes. Um, no pressure, my friends, but we can do this. And I also think I like what you're saying. And for me, there's been something too about thinking of, and it's easier for me, I think, right now because I have children. But I think
Mhm.
you could say this for any child in your life, like any younger person that's a part of your life, that and this is part of getting out of the trance of capitalist patriarchy as well, is that there is something that matters beyond our individual lives. Like what are we leaving? What are we leaving behind? And what are we putting in motion?
Mhm.
It's been a big practice for me too of thinking like, well, I'm doing everything I can. Sometimes I think of it as I am unraveling and creating at the same, like what can I disentangle for my
Mhm.
children, just to the extent that I can, and then offer that to them and just know that it will keep going. Um,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
trust that the energy behind it is going to carry it towards a place where we'll all be better off, even if I don't ever see it, because I want that world for them and not
Yes.
even people that I do know. I want it for everybody, you know?
Yes.
So,
Yes. No, I
yeah,
agree. And when you look across the world and you see all the difficulties that are going on, it's hard to hold the faith.
I know. I know. Well, conversations like this help me tremendously. If people want to learn more about you, Arla, and your work, it's I will definitely put all this into show notes. But there is a website for the Coalition of Natives and Allies, correct?
Absolutely. And it is just that coalition of natives and allies.org.
Okay.
And if anyone is interested in how they can support this and stay informed, we do put out I put out constant contacts. It's just me. The list isn't shared with anybody. And the most I ever get around to doing is maybe once a week. And as things, depending on what happens in this election coming up, as things move forward and we do need support, letters of support for this legislation can be huge. I mean, in Maine, they just had flooding of letters all the way from children in elementary school all the way to prominent people in positions of power. So if anyone wants to follow this and be part of it, or if any organization would like us to come either through Zoom or in person to do our presentation, that's a possibility as well. And then my own website is just arlapatch.com.
Wonderful. And do you feel that letters from outside of the state of Pennsylvania are also helpful? And is it helpful to be in conversation with people outside of the state of Pennsylvania in terms of education right now? What do you think?
Well, I know that I've been told legislators really only care about the people who are going to vote for them.
Yeah.
So that is important. So Pennsylvanians, we are especially interested in your support, but I can't help but think that since this is a nationwide issue, that there are thousands of schools across this country who are still using native mascots. I don't know. I think the more the better, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
or
certainly can't
starting
hurt.
it in your communities. I mean, checking out with your school. Does your school's district use a native? We actually, you'll find on our website, the coalition's website, we came up with 6 things you can actually do to honor Native Americans in your school system. And they're really concrete and beautiful gestures. I mean, if every school across this country, when you walked into the lobby, you saw a portrait of either current or historic Native person whose land you're on, and then you had an acknowledgement written there of whose land you're on, to me, just even that one step would raise awareness and consciousness. But there's 6 of them, and they really have a lot of power that could be implemented in school systems.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I will definitely make sure to get this in the show notes. And I also know that there are Indigenous artists who are creating posters. We had some done and put up at my kids' school back in California, and I think they were not specific. They were Indigenous artists, but they weren't making them for each specific tribe. So I don't know if it was specifically tied to that land, but it was still Indigenous artists who had where
Mm,
you could just, you could print them out, make them look really nice, and write whose land you were on. And we had those put
mm.
up at my kids' elementary school back in California, which is, and these are things that you can absolutely
I,
you can do to start.
I do just want to say land acknowledgement is a really, really first basic little early step.
Yeah,
That is, it's important, but you really also need to go beyond that and
yeah.
find out what else you could do. And even if it's, just raising money for some group or cause or whatever, just to put it into action. The awareness is a good step and a good beginning, but it's just a first step. for sure.
Yes. Yes. And I'm guessing you would say too, and the action that you are looking to take, you should be following Indigenous leadership. It is not that you need to go out necessarily and like build a brand new thing.
Yeah.
Would you,
Yes,
is that correct?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Oh, Arla, I was so excited we finally made this happen. Thank you so much for your time and your work and your
Thank you.
activism. It's an honor to know you. And
Thank
to
you. I'm really grateful to get a voice to be able to share, especially some of these ideas that maybe people from here on now will like take action or think of things differently. That would be huge. That would be great.
yes, may this cause a ripple, and
Yeah,
see where it goes.
yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you, as always, for listening. Just so grateful for you being here. Hey, you know what? Reach out to me. I had such a privilege of getting to meet a couple of podcast listeners at my book launch in California, and it was the coolest thing, really. I mean, I'm putting this out there. I don't always get a lot of feedback. You can do that in formal channels, and that definitely helps people find the show. So if you want to review the show through iTunes or things like that, you want to share it with people, or you want to subscribe, all of that really helps. But if you want to send me a message through social media or whatever and just tell me you're listening or tell me what you think or ask me a question or tell me if I've missed the mark, whatever. I love hearing from you. I really do. So please do that. And until next time, we'll talk to you again soon.